Can I get an F in the chat for the Threadripper 1950X? It served me so well for 5 years till its untimely demise yesterday. Anyone? F to pay respects. So on a completely serious note, my computer did actually die yesterday, and I am very disappointed. So today I am building a new one because nothing screams urgency like not being able to do anything at all because everything relies on your desktop. And before you ask, no, I did not lose any data. The SSD on the board is still fine. It still has Windows on it. I can boot it up on another system. I just don't have another system to boot it up on. And even if the SSD was not fine, I have quite good backups. I'm very proud of the work I've spent in the last year or so getting my backups in order, my different backup systems, all my video files, video projects, they're all safe. The problem is I don't have a computer to finish them on. So my video last week got delayed a bit because I couldn't put the finishing touches on the edit. I had to make some minor changes after I uploaded it, and I couldn't. So yeah, my disaster recovery plan had thought really thoroughly about how all of the data would stay safe, but it didn't think about what happens when a system dies. So my workstation died, the data was safe, but the data being safe doesn't help me if I can't continue to operate with it. So this is kind of how they say RAID is not a backup. It's a like data continuity or like continuity of business. So having RAID doesn't mean your data is safe, but it means you can keep operating while you fix the problem. And so I had data that was safe, but I couldn't continue operating while I fixed the problem. Very sad. So here are the remnants of my computer. I got some more parts scattered back there because I've been taking it apart, and I didn't think to film while I was desperately troubleshooting, trying to get it to work again. Turns out it is in fact the motherboard, which is very unfortunate. So let's go over a bit about the specs of what I had before. So this beautiful system is affectionately known as White Knight 2, after an aircraft. That picture will probably be on your screen now. Beautiful aircraft, beautiful white and black computer. It featured a Threadripper 1950X. It's a first-gen, high-end desktop system. Absolutely love it. Absolutely fantastic for rendering especially. And, you know, when you make YouTube videos, you do a lot of rendering. So, rendering beast. Plenty of PCIe slots. So I had plenty of projects planned that needed all these slots with my Tesla P4s that I ordered and never used. I have the Intel Xeon Phi that I ordered and never used that someday I'll get around to again. And F in the chat for all those PCIe slots because this had a ton of them. And all of them go straight to the CPU. 64 PCIe lanes is beautiful. So this monster is beast, 180 watts TDP. I have measured the system at something close to 500 watts when running, which with half of the GPU, half CPU, that's like 210 watts each or something like that. And yeah, it puts out a ton of heat. So to deal with that heat, I have this beautiful Corsair all-in-one liquid cooler system that has served me well for a couple of years. I started with the Enermax TR4, and that one clogged up because if you were around 5 years ago, that was a known problem. Got the Corsair. It doesn't quite have full contact on the IHS, but that's okay. I guess it seems to be working fine. Got a ton of fans. So not shown because this is on the back, but this is my RX 5700 XT graphics card that I love very much. It again is quite good at rendering, although I'm not actually using it in any of my video production workflow because most of my stuff uses either codecs that this can't do or because DaVinci Resolve can't use the codecs on this because it prefers NVIDIA. Because it's CUDA optimized. It's gotta love vendor lock-in from NVIDIA. But it's a great card otherwise. I do a ton of VR gaming on it, which is so much fun. I just love VR. So when I came home one day, the system was powered on. All the fans were running at full blast, which was really odd. They normally don't do that, obviously. So my first thought was that the cooler had broken and that the CPU was overheating, so the fans were running full blast to compensate. But there was no graphics output, nothing was working. So I powered it off and the power button didn't work. It was just stuck, so it was maddening. So if my first thought was that no graphics output, it's not doing anything, I tried a new graphics card. So I got my trusty WX3100. I love this little tiny thing. It's not that powerful, but it's super great for testing with how small it is. And of course, same story, it was not the graphics card. So then I started looking and thinking, how many cables actually plug into this thing? It's really just USB front panel I/O and power. There's 4 power cables that go to the board, 24-pin ATX, the 8-pin EPS 12 volt, the 4-pin EPS 12 volt, and 6-pin PCIe power. And I don't have any hard drives, I don't have any 2.5-inch SSDs, I just have the M.2, and everything else is on a PCIe slot, so it's not really a cable plugged in, nothing's pulling down the 5-volt rail. I tried unplugging all the cables, pulled the motherboard out and powered it up outside of the case. Same problem. The little lights on the bottom here, if I hold this up, these lights are supposed to show the postcode status, and they go through different hex letters as it boots up. They were not doing anything. So the fact the postcode lights weren't working was a pretty good indication that it was not the CPU, because usually if there's no CPU, you get a postcode error that says like there's no CPU. I could try reseating the socket. That was an issue on some of these early TR4 boards, but I pulled it out, I held it down with my hand because it needs a crap ton of mounting pressure, and it didn't even attempt to get like above room temperature. It's not doing any work. The CPU is not running. So that leads me to the conclusion, it is the motherboard. Very sad. Unfortunately for me, socket TR4 was not a very long-lived socket. It was only used by 2 generations of Threadrippers, and that's a grand total of like 6 SKUs. And they were all high-end desktops, so not a lot of people had them. They were really only used by professionals that needed the crap ton of PCIe lanes, and people that did virtualization and needed the crap ton of PCIe lanes like me. So, yeah, they're crazy expensive on eBay. So I might as well just build a new system. Well, not new, because I'm not going to buy a new graphics card. Those are too expensive for me now. But keeping the case, keeping the GPU, keeping the power supply, keeping the SSD, but I'm getting a new CPU, a new motherboard, and if I go to DDR5, I have to get new RAM, because all my RAM is DDR4. So thankfully for me, I've been researching this very thing for the past couple months. I know in a previous video I said I wanted to build a 3-node cluster. My original plan, that went out the window now, was to take my existing Ryzen 3400G, that's an APU system. That's what I do a ton of Proxmox testing on. It's fantastic. Not super powerful though, so I need to supplement it. So my thought was to have the 3400G. I was going to get a Ryzen 3000 or 5000 series CPU used, along with an AM4 motherboard used, and that would be my second system, and then the Threadripper would become the third system. So I would virtualize Windows on the Threadripper. That would give me the performance I need to do rendering and stuff like that when I need it, but also to do other virtualization stuff in the background most of the time. And so my long-term plan was to take this system, add a second graphics card to it, put it in the basement, run giant DisplayPort cables from the basement up here, along with USB 3 to break out all my peripherals. And then after that was done, I could virtualize Windows on Proxmox, and after that was done, I could take the Threadripper and add it to the cluster. And that was my long-term plan, and is dead. But I'd already been looking at used CPUs, 3600s, 3800s, that kind of thing. So I was kind of familiar with pricing and that kind of stuff. So I decided that I'm still going to have to build 2 cluster nodes now, because this one's dead, plus the 3400G I already have. And I'm just going to build a desktop that's going to be a desktop. It's not going to be a virtualization powerhouse like this one was, and I'm just going to have to do virtualization on another system. So let's go buy some parts. So here we are at Micro Center. It's pretty hot out, so head inside. Look at all this stuff. So at this point, I'm taking apart the old motherboard, taking everything useful off of it. So there's still mounting hardware on it from the water cooler and the CPU itself, so I gotta unmount the socket. The TR4 socket, again, has a ton of mounting pressure. I'm putting it back in the original box. The original box was really beautiful, and I really loved it, so I'm gonna keep it. Hopefully I can find a board for it someday, but I'm not keeping my hopes up. I'm putting the board back in its original case too, trying to keep the socket safe, making sure I get all that mounting hardware off. I got to strip out the water cooler out of the case. I'm not going to reuse it. I'm just going to put it back in its original box and keep it. So I'm going to unmount it. I am going to take the fans off though and put those back where the radiator was. Got a little Ziploc there for all the mounting hardware. At this point I realized my decision to push air through the radiator meant it got real dirty. do clean the computer, but this was too far in for me to tell. Making sure everything's in there that goes in there. So I'm trying to figure out how I want to mount the fans. I decided to use these little rubber things that come with Noctua fans. I didn't really have any fan mounting screws, and I wanted to get it built immediately. I have to decide what power cables I need. So I don't need the PCIe 6-pin to the motherboard because the motherboard takes 2 EPS connectors instead of a EPS and a PCIe. I also don't need SATA power anymore. I was only using SATA power for the water pump, but I don't have a water pump anymore. So there's a new board. It's an MSI X670. I chose it because it had 2.5 gig Ethernet, which was one of my absolute must-haves in a board. Basically, it was on sale at Micro Center, and I needed it, and it was not an outrageous price. There's plenty of M.2 slots, 2.5 gig Ethernet, tons of USB 3, 2 display outputs, so I can use the iGPU if I ever want to use it for Proxmox, which I don't think I will, but maybe someday this will be a server again. Don't really care about SATA. It is a little bit short on USB, so I'm probably going to get like a 4-port USB connector to put in the PCIe slot to connect to the motherboard USB headers, because those are all unused right now. So I'm using the box cooler because the AMD box coolers are decent. If I ever upgrade it, I'm definitely going to stick with an air cooler for this. I'm not at the power level that I need to use a water cooler. It's only a 65 watt CPU, but apparently you can push it to about 100 watts or so. At this point I realized there's some EMI fingers on the motherboard shield that are in the way, and they're absolutely maddening. And I even missed one, so I had to come back later and bend it out, the Ethernet jack. Then I gotta get all the screws in, all the tight places, and get those EPS 12 volt connectors in the top right below those fans. The HD audio connector got trapped behind the motherboard. I had to free it. I do actually use the front panel audio for headphones a lot, so I wanted that to work. My case says USB 3 instead of USB-C, so even though the board has a front panel USB-C, I'm only using the front panel USB 3 header. There we go. I got a bunch of RGB, which I kind of hate, but I can disable it for later. It went straight into the BIOS and didn't want to boot Windows, and it was maddening to try to figure out why my mouse didn't work and nothing worked. Eventually I figured out my mouse was just set to use Bluetooth instead of the dongle because I had been using it with my laptop when my computer was dead. The BIOS on this board is not that great. You basically have to search for settings by name, which is kind of hard if you don't know exactly what they're named. But I figured it out. I might go back in and disable the firmware TPM so Windows stops bugging me to upgrade to Windows 11. I don't want to have it upgrade in my sleep. So at this point I'm putting it back where it belongs, behind the monitor. Yeah, I realized there that my Ethernet connector had a metal tab sticking in it from the EMI shield. Trying to plug everything in, all the cables I use for my day-to-day stuff. And there's the pile of PCIe cards I didn't end up using. All the extra networking cards my old computer had in it that I won't be able to use anymore. It took a long time to figure out why it wouldn't boot Windows, and eventually I ran the Windows installer ISO and just told it to reload the bootloader. And Windows was super dumb and just reloaded the bootloader onto the flash drive it was running from instead of onto the SSD, even though it saw the SSD and it saw the C drive. Like, come on, Windows, come on. But now it works fine. So computer's up and running now. The only major hurdle I had was that the BIOS wouldn't boot Windows. It didn't seem to see the EFI partition on my SSD as bootable. So it booted from USB disks fine, but it wouldn't boot Windows. And I couldn't force it because it was only letting me choose from the options that had detected an EFI partition on. which is great. So I wanted Windows to run startup repair to reload the EFI partition. And startup repair said, oh, nothing's wrong. So I said, okay, go into the command line in the Windows installer, which is kind of a pain, and force it to reload the EFI partition. And it's like, oh, I found a disk and I loaded the EFI partition on it. And it overwrote my Ventoy drive, which had the Windows ISO on it, which was absolutely maddening because then I had no Ventoy drive. And it had wiped out the Windows ISO I just downloaded, which is great. So eventually got back in there, forced it to tell it which drives to load the EFI partition on. It did. BIOS saw that, booted right in, and Windows is mad about activation, but that's a Windows problem.
And Linus's personal view of Microsoft?
From an OS perspective, they just suck.
I mentioned I have some cards I didn't put back in. So the Radeon, this is just a test card. It's not permanent. I use this on a lot of my systems to test. It's great because it's pretty low cost, so it's not like I'm wasting a $500 NVIDIA card. That's what modern graphics cards are these days. Like, damn. The other two cards I have this beautiful Asus 10 gig card that has an Aquantia chipset. So it's the N-base T, so 1 gig, 2.5, 510. This is what I was using before, and I added off of my NAS. So I need high-speed networking to the NAS. And the NAS has 10 gig and the switch has 10 gig. But because I'm running with Cat5 cabling and I'm going a decent distance, not 5E, just 5, the best it was able to negotiate was 5 gig. And they're going to 2 spinning disks anyway. So when I'm copying to and from my machine, especially to the disks when it's writing, I was only able to get about 3 gigabits per second or so. So going down to 2.5 gig built into the motherboard means I don't have to put a card in. So I have onboard 2.5 gig, and it's about as fast as it was before for sequential things. So bursty things could have been fast with 5 gig, but it's not a massive difference, I don't think. And it's definitely worth having it on board the motherboard instead of trying to find an expensive motherboard with onboard 10 gig. The other card I had was the Supermicro, which is a clone of the Intel X520 DA card. So this is a fiber card. I use this for testing fiber. And this will probably go on my servers downstairs. Some of my servers already have this card. Either this one, the X520, or the Mellanox 25 gig. That's the Connect X4, I think, or Connect X3, something like that. One of my servers has a dual port Connect X card, and another one has an X520. So where do I go from here? So first of all, I put up a number of places that my computer had died, and I was really having a pretty rough day Wednesday when it died. And so I was quite distraught over that, but a number of you very, very kindly donated. Real big special thanks to my grandma and the people that donated on Ko-fi. So I set up a Ko-fi page, link in the description. I'm not going to enable subscriptions or anything like that yet. I don't feel like I'm at that sort of scale where I'm ready to accept like recurring donations. But I guess I'm willing to accept one-off donations at this point. I might also add like commissions or things like that if you want me to like build any of the projects I have, especially the hardware ones. If you want your own versions of those, I'm sure I can make that happen. Also, big thanks to the people that donated on my Ko-fi publicly to support the computer build. So your names are already on Ko-fi publicly. So John Carrick, Andre Klarner, Turkaz, Karsten R, and Mindsolve. Thank you very much for your donations. Greatly appreciated. Helped me getting this computer back up and running. As you saw in the video, I went to Micro Center. I bought all the parts in person so I wouldn't have to wait for shipping. I was probably going to buy from Micro Center anyway because I've had bad experiences with Newegg in the past couple of years. They used to be a lot better than they are now. And the prices were pretty reasonable for what I was getting, and they had them in stock. So, as I said in the video, it's a Ryzen 7600, which is a mid-tier CPU, but of the latest generation, so being 4 generations newer than my Threadripper, it's still pretty fast and quite power efficient. The big thing I'm missing out on is PCIe lanes. This has 24 instead of the old 64. But I still have 16 to the GPU. I have 4 to the M.2. I'm running the NVMe off of the chipset. So the chipset has PCIe Gen 4, and it has lanes coming out that are Gen 3. So my I/O through the chipset is now much faster, and I can run things through the chipset without worrying about going down to PCIe Gen 2. I actually moved the SSD a couple of times trying to get it to boot with Windows, which is why it's on one of the chipset lanes, but that's fine. I still do have one slot to the CPU open, so I could put a second graphics card or a high-speed networking card or something in if I need to in the future. And the way the motherboard's laid out, I can actually use that slot with the GPU I have, because the second high-speed slot is at the bottom, which is nice. So it's usable with my really fat GPU. So yeah, so thanks to everyone for your support. It's really meant a whole lot to me that you guys have supported me in this PC build. I hope you enjoyed the time-lapse footage. If you like more of that kind of thing, I don't tend to do as much hardware work, honestly, because it costs so much. So I do this as a hobby, kind of, and YouTube doesn't exactly produce a ton of income. I've been trying to take on more sponsors, as you might have noticed, but that's not always the most effective either. So I'm doing hardware videos when I can. They're a lot of fun. Software videos are a lot of fun too, though. I mean, there's a ton of things in setting up networking, setting up home lab services and stuff like that. That's a ton of fun. And also because I keep telling myself I have hardware that I need to make videos on. So I have like the Tesla P4s. I have the Xeon Feed that I need to take some time to look at. And these are all things that I've already bought. I have my tape drive. Maybe I'll get to look at that soon. But yeah, let me know if you guys like this more hardware build series. I mean, I enjoy building computers, but I don't have a great need for a lot of them. So I do enjoy computer building. I'd love to do case design too. Maybe I'll do a live stream or something of that in maybe a month or so when I'm not quite so busy. But yeah, there's definitely not a lot of good rack mount cases that I feel like for like small home lab kind of people, especially because I have a short rack. I have a network rack. It's a 2-post rack. I'm sure you've seen the video on it. But yeah, so thanks to everyone who supported me. It really makes a big difference. I am going on with a new computer. It is rendering great, so that's what matters. And I'll keep having some videos for you. I got Discord down below. I got the Ko-fi down below if you're interested in donating. I have my website down below, which I've just made a video on redesigning the website, which is really cool. So go check that out. And feel free to try me on Discord. And as always, I'll see you guys in the next adventure. Take care.